It's that time again, another episode of Critical History. After spending the last few weeks looking at the finer details, the intricacies, and mysteries of the Age of Exploration and the Italian Wars, today we look at a truly world-changing event. The mother of all sieges. No, not Troy. The 1453 Siege of Constantinople. Why do you think the Portuguese started sailing all the way around Africa? And explorers like Columbus, Vespucci, and Cabot started sailing west, looking for India. Why? Because after the conquest of Constantinople, Western Europe no longer had access to its hundreds of years old trade routes. Constantinople was considered the center of the world, where east met west, quite literally. The question arises, couldn't the trade routes simply go north or south of Constantinople? Well, let's take a look at that for a sec. To the north would entail the use of the Caspian Sea, the Volga-Don portage routes, the Kerch Strait past the Crimean Peninsula, and then the Danube. The Genoese controlled ports on the Crimean Peninsula after all, right? Yeah, about that. They controlled part of the southern and southwestern coast, but not the Kerch Strait. And by 1475, the Ottomans had conquered the entirety of the peninsula. Even more evidence that trade routes to the east being cut off resulted in the Age of Exploration. Alright, but what about to the south? Surely traders could use the Red Sea to get to the Sinai Peninsula, and then with a short overland route, load their goods on board a ship in the Mediterranean. Traders would surely pay a premium for access to the one and only route available to them. Well, yes and no. The problem is that the Western European nations weren't exactly on good terms with the Mamluks, who were ruling Egypt and the Holy Land. You know, mainly because of a little thing called the Crusades. Check out my video on the Crusades if you want to know more. The Ottomans, on the other hand, tended to be on pretty good terms with the Mamluks. Conflict between the two only came later. That many of the Mamluks came from the Black Sea region is also worth noting. All this spells out pretty clearly why cooperation would have been a good idea for Muscovy, the Rus, and the Horde. You might also be wondering how Muslims and Orthodox Christians could possibly be allies, and the answer to that is twofold. Firstly, we tend to project current trends and beliefs of the time we live in back into history. We've also been instilled with this idea that wars historically happened due to religious differences. And it is true, religious differences have often been used to fuel the flames of conflict, to help with recruiting and generating sufficient zeal, but that doesn't mean those differences caused the conflict. And secondly, leaning on the work of Anatoly Fomenko once again, Fomenko suggests there may not have been as great a difference between Orthodoxy and Islam in this time period as we commonly assume. If you want to know more, you could check out either the work of Fomenko, who has discussed this in depth in his 4th book, which has been translated to English, or you could read up a little on Nestorian Christianity, which was historically believed to have either transformed into or merged with Islam. Modern scholars, let's not even go there. I'm supposed to provide evidence, right? Okay, well, have you ever heard of Mount Athos? A massive congregation of monasteries, with monks from all across Christendom. Well, it was burnt and looted by Catalan mercenaries in the early 1300s, but when Mehmet's father, Murad, conquered Thessalonica, the monks immediately pledged their allegiance. The following few centuries were times of peace and prosperity for the monks. So back to the epic siege of Constantinople. The Ottomans were setting the groundwork for this conquest for decades. They already had much more than a foothold in Rumelia and had thoroughly consolidated their control over almost the entirety of Anatolia. We've talked about the importance of Constantinople before in previous videos and how it was viewed by Europeans throughout the medieval period as being the literal center of the world. But why was it necessary for the Ottomans to conquer it then and there, in 1453? For the answer to that, we have to take a closer look at Mehmet II, aka Mehmet the Conqueror. Just spelling out the obvious here, but Mehmet is just another form of the name Muhammad. Mehmet's father, Murad, had also tried to conquer Constantinople 30 years earlier, after they attempted to usurp his power by releasing a pretender to the throne to challenge him. The Ottoman sultans, of course, used harems. This is one of the things they are most famous for these days, and that meant a lot of offspring. And that was also why it became customary for the first in line to the throne to have all his half-brothers strangled the very moment news arrived of the previous sultan's death. So Mehmet wanted to accomplish what his father couldn't. He staked his entire reputation, his reason to rule, around the conquest of the city. If he failed, he expected to be deposed at best and assassinated at worst. From a personal perspective, therefore, it was literally life or death for Mehmet. Interestingly enough, Mehmet's mother is believed to have born either in Italy or Macedonia. After his mother and father died, a few years before 1453, Mehmet named one of his father's other wives, the daughter of the king of Serbia, as his Valid Sultan, the official queen mother. So much like the Romanovs had a habit of marrying nobility from the Holstein-Gottorp region, it seems the Ottoman sultans, at least in this particular time period, had a similar habit of taking Orthodox brides. And if you're going to preach to me about how bad taking multiple wives is, remember, we just covered Henry VIII in the previous video. And the Borgia Pope at this time also fathered children from numerous mistresses. So the only difference, in my opinion, is de jure, not de facto. So back to Mehmet. When he was only about 11 or 12, his father abdicated in order to ensure a smooth succession during a time of peace. It didn't work out though, as the Ottomans' enemies perceived the reign of a young, inexperienced sultan to mean that the empire was weak and vulnerable. The Hungarians invaded, and Mehmet, being but a boy, was unable to inspire confidence in his troops. Imagine playing Call of Duty, or my personal favorite, Arma, and taking orders from someone whose voice is cracking. Enough said. So Mehmet sent for his father and asked him, "Are you the Sultan or am I? If you are the Sultan, come and lead your troops. If I am the Sultan, I command you to come lead my troops." Sure enough, Murad returned and led the Ottomans to victory at the Battle of Varna. The Grand Vizier at this time was arguably more powerful and wealthier than even the Sultan and his family. And when the Byzantine Emperor threatened to provide his backing to a pretender to Mehmet's throne, the Vizier responded, "We have known of your cunning ways for long enough. Murad was lenient and a friend to you. Mehmet is different. You are fools to think that you can frighten us with your fantasies when the ink on our recent treaty of peace is barely dry. We are not children without strength or sense. If you think you can start something, do so. If you want to proclaim Orhan a sultan in Thrace, go ahead. If you want to bring the Hungarians across the Danube, do it. If you want to recover places that you lost long since, try it. But know this, you will make no headway in any of these things. All that you will do is lose what little you have." After his father's abdication for a second time, Mehmet knew this was his last shot at gaining credibility and prestige and remaining on the throne. He ordered his men to invade the Peloponnesus, the remaining Byzantine stronghold besides Constantinople. Then he ordered a fortress built on the European side of the Bosporan Straits. It seems likely he wanted to goad the Byzantines out of their fortress, and in this regard he was unsuccessful, but he did succeed in constructing the fortress in record time, start to finish in just over 4 months. The fortress received the nickname Throat Slitter. This gave the Ottomans control of the strait, which is of tremendous strategic importance even today. They started levying tolls and sinking the ships of all those who refused to pay, using their cannons. A bit of an Ottoman specialty, as covered in my previous videos on the Italian Wars. The story goes that Urban, the man who designed the basilisk megacannon, first approached Constantine, but Constantine didn't have the necessary resources. I'm not sure that makes sense though, because you don't really need a megacannon to defend a well-fortified city, but you sure do need it to conquer it. Apparently Urban's first megacannons were installed at the newly built fortress, and when Mehmet saw how successful they were, he ordered more and bigger cannons to be built, to be used in the siege. In February 1453, with preparations complete, the Ottoman army, upwards of 100,000 soldiers, set off to the beat of war drums. Another 100,000 were there simply to take care of logistics, such as driving the wagons, fetching supplies, helping with the camp, and so on. What's often underestimated these days is the amount of digging and construction work that a siege entailed. It is said it took 2 months to escort the megacannons all the way to the city's walls. In the meantime, the Byzantines set about gathering supplies and strengthening the walls. The weakest section of the walls were not the land walls, rather the Theodosian walls were the strongest. The weakness were the sea walls, inside the Golden Horn. But the Golden Horn was cut off by a massive steel boom chain, held afloat by wooden blocks. Constantinople was well fortified, but 16 kilometers of walls? You would need over 30,000 men just to man 2 men for every meter. On April 6th, the formidable Ottoman army surrounded the city. Everywhere except the weakest section of walls was under threat. The Byzantines were given the opportunity to surrender, but this was declined. Not long after, the first megacannon was unleashed, setting off panic within the city. Many of the citizens, though, had already fled in the weeks prior. Lucky for the Byzantines, though, these big guns could only be fired between 3 to 8 times a day, 10 if the Ottomans were feeling lucky. Why? Because not only did it take 2 hours to reload a 600 kilogram stone ball in, it took hours for the cannons to cool sufficiently for them to be reused. Special oil was even poured on them to help them cool. Allegedly, one of the mega cannons exploded, taking Orban with it. Talk about going out with a bang. Meanwhile, in the time it took to reload the cannons, the Byzantines would send men to repair the damage that had been done. For the first month, the siege was a stalemate. The Janissaries, being the best soldiers, were held in reserve, and the less well-armed infantry was becoming demoralized at the continued prospect of serving as cannon fodder. If you had at least the prospect of achieving fame and glory, that was one thing. But if you thought your efforts were futile, then, just as things appeared bleak, a series of events occurred that tilted things back in the Ottomans' favor. A volcanic eruption on the other side of the planet. A lunar eclipse that appeared blood red. A description which just so happened to coincide with the prophecy of the city's demise. An extremely unusual and brutal hailstorm, complete with lightning, thunder, and a downpour of rain. The following day, unheard of thick fog. But there was still the question of how to defeat the boom chain protecting the Golden Horn and its weak seawalls. Unfortunately though, we'll have to leave that for next time. Tune in to the next episode to find out how the siege went down, the motivational methods utilized by the Ottomans, and more, including why the Western European nations that stood to lose so much from losing access to their trade routes were unable to intervene. And if you enjoyed this video, hit the like, smash the subscribe, check back in the next few days for the next episode of Critical History, and until then, you know the drill. Stay critical.